Well, it turns out, with a new season, there is quite a lot to talk about. We still have to talk about Mel, how she got a pretty cool skin that is canon, but also you have to buy it, and how the abilities are wild, but everyone actually loves it. And then hey, you hop into the client and there's a comic all of a sudden. And since there is a lot to talk about and we have to speed up the process of making videos, you know what that means. I'm about to lose my legs. So why don't we go into the client and have a look at the new comic that was put together by Max Folkman and Anastasia Basil. So, this is what you're gonna see when you log into the new season of League of Legends, and I have to say, this is incredibly clean. In the dev video, which we covered in the last video, they mentioned that they try to simplify the client and make everything better, and I think they succeeded at this. All of this looks really good. We have a separate tab for the season, we have the new tab for whatever is currently happening, which right now is the comic. We're gonna dive into that in a second. There's also a separate tab for ranked with all of those rewards, and if you just wanna see what's happening with the battle pass, there's a new button for that right here, and that's gonna show you your progress. Now, it is in different chapters, and I assume it's because it's locked behind time, because why else would it be chapters? I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure on that. But regardless, when it comes to the readability and the quality of the hub, it's really good. So that was just a quick rant of how I like that. But now, let's dive directly into Mordekaiser's comic, which reveals not only some really cool lore, but also a potential gacha. So, just like with what happened with Aurora, this is a motion comic, which means stuff moves and is animated. And just look at this. It's cool. So quickly, before we dive into the lore, just big props to the team that put this together. This should be the new gold standard for how Riot is telling their stories in League of Legends. This is far more accessible to the wider audience compared to just big written stories. So please, give us one of these every season, and I'm gonna be happy. But here, of course, we are diving into the story of Mordekaiser, which is why, as we go through this, you might notice that people look slightly more barbarian. And this is because, at the very beginning of his lore, as you may know, well, at the beginning of Mordekaiser's story, when he was still known as San Uzal, he was a barbarian warlord, which means he was fighting among barbarian tribes. That is why people here look very primal and berserk-like. This is simply what Noxus looked like before it was even known as Noxus. Back in the day, it was simply known as the Northern Wildlands. And here we get introduced to Katashli, which is how I believe it is pronounced, who, as you can see, was a renowned general in a great army, and of course now we know this is Mordekaiser's fellow. And in fact, in the next scene, we can see that he is fighting among none other than San Uzal himself. Yes, this is indeed our very first look at the human Mordekaiser. And immediately at the beginning, you might notice one thing. It looks slightly different from the concept we've seen before. However, that is likely because this predates even that concept. The concept we got for Legends of Runeterra was when Mordekaiser's armor was already forged for his growing empire. At this point, he was still more of a barbarian conqueror. So this is probably the most primal version of San Uzal we're gonna see. And indeed, there he is. This is San Uzal. Now, first of all, I love his old title, the Unconquered King. But let's focus on the appearance first. First of all, he does have some kind of a bony mace, which is pretty awesome. Again, think of barbarians and berserks. But also, if you look at him, he's quite far away from what I thought he would look like based on the concepts. But you know, again, it fits the barbarian look, so it's, yeah, whatever. The one thing that we can point out is that he is ginger. There are so many jokes I can make about him not having a soul. Anyway, just remember this human form for now. It is gonna be important in a second. And yes, we can point out that even here, as the first conqueror of these lands, he already had a crown that had those bunny ears, which Mordekaiser does have now. But anyway, during this time, as San Uzal was conquering the lands and there was just massacre and destruction everywhere, the comic mentions that violence attracts more violence. By which it is actually referencing demons. As you may know, demons really like preying on emotions. We have Fiddlesticks preying on fear, and since fear is present everywhere in this universe, Fiddlesticks is one of the most powerful demons out there. You have Tahm Kench being all about greed, you have Evelyn being pleasure, I guess. Although she does like to twist it into terror, so... Of course you have Nocturne with nightmares and stuff like that. And now we are getting introduced to Atakhan, a demon that very much likes violence. But before we get to that, there is a really funny thing we can point out. Apparently San Uzal does not have friends. He only cares about people that he can use, which means he's kind of like a Mumu, I guess. But more importantly, ignore Atakhan just lurking over them. What we should be focusing on is the fact that they are playing Legends of Runeterra. Yes, San Uzal is playing cards with his best buddy. And if you really zoom in on the card backs, those are the default card backs of Legends of Runeterra. So yes, lore mentioned. But yes, our two buddies get jumped by Atakhan, and already you may notice that he looks different from what we've seen in Legends of Runeterra. In fact, here Atakhan looks the way he does in the game currently. What's cool about that is that there is a big lore reason why that is the case. Again, that comes later. And even in this comic, it is confirmed that, yes, Atakhan is a demon. But notice that at this stage, that demon has somewhat human arms. It is just a cool detail that comes back later. Now here the comic says how the demons lie, and they defy, and they hunger, and they just do all sorts of bad things, which actually relates back to the old Yasuo cinematic. There you may remember one of the Azakana, which is an Ionian word for a demon, lying to Yasuo to draw out his emotions. So what's mentioned here was proven again and again in the past. And here you can see that Katashli, devoted to his king, was absolutely ready to lay his life on the line. Which he did, and for that he actually dies. Cool fact here, you can actually see how Atakhan is using the soul-draining dark magic that you can see him use in the game. And so, with Katashli dead, San Uzal has to take things into his own hands, and so he just kills the demon in a single hit. This is actually incredibly cool, because it shows us that from the very beginning, San Uzal kinda had a thing for death. Again, remember that San Uzal believed in slaughter from the very beginning. From the very beginning, his goal was to kill as many people as possible for the honors of the gods of the underworld, which ended up not existing, and so his faith was false. Anyway, already taking the concept of defying death, this comic shows us that he was ready to do anything to just deal with it. And in fact, the way he dealt with it is incredibly cool, and it pays attention to some deep lore. First of all, in this shot we can see that there's an altar with the old helmet of Katashli, as well as his body next to Atakhan on the ground. And the comic states that as San Uzal conquered the surrounding lands, they found scrolls that allowed them to bind souls into objects. Which is actually incredibly clever, because not only is this how Mordekaiser eventually gets banished himself, more on that in a second, but also it makes sense that such a scroll would exist, because this is the magic that the Celestials gave to people, so that the mortals would be able to banish the Darkin inside powerful weapons. Again, remember, this story is happening directly after the Darkin Wars. So the knowledge of this magical binding was already out there. Not only that, at first sight, while this might seem like they are using some kind of dark magic, again, remember that this is already happening after the Darkin Wars, but also it is happening while Vladimir was already out there, which means he was already becoming a myth, and it is possible that blood magic was starting to get spread around. So everything you can see here on screen is actually incredibly cool. And it is paying attention to some deep lore. Anyway, long story short, yes, it is absolutely possible that Atakhan was bound using the same magic that banished the Darkin. Or at least some kind of a lesser version of it. And so of course, that's what we can see here. We can see that Katashli's body, together with Atakhan's body, was fused and bound together using his helm. And what's interesting is that you can already see that this is based on runic magic. So now I wonder, is this somehow related to the green runes that are inscribed by the Black Rose? In other words, heading back to the cinematic, is it possible that some weapons, such as Riven's runed blade, can be used to bind souls. For example, is it possible that the entire time LeBlanc is planning to use Riven's blade to bind Mordekaiser's soul? Sorry, that's a bit of a tinfoil hat tangent. What I meant to say is that, hey, this comic is really cool. And it gets cooler when we see the final form of the new bound Atakhan. Yes, this is what the demon looked like in its primal form when it was fused with mortals. And I have to say, this looks nuts. Mordekaiser essentially turned his best friend, because again, remember, he doesn't really have friends, into a glorious demonic living weapon. And what's the coolest of all of this is that in the background, yes, you can see Mordekaiser. Now, why is this important? Well, if you go back to the dev video, you may know that Riot confirmed that Mordekaiser will be the one who is getting the exalted skin. In other words, he is getting the gacha skin. Now, if you go back to where we saw him the first time as a human, which is where, you know, he was shown as being Ginger, you can see that they are very specifically saying San Uzal, the unconquered king. Another tinfoil hat theory, I believe that is what's gonna be the name of the exalted skin. The exalted skin for Mordekaiser is gonna be San Uzal, the unconquered king. But more than that, you know how the exalted skins have different forms? Just like what Sed has, as well as Jinx? Well, this is one form that he can have, you know, with the bony weapon and just him being a barbarian. While here, he is shown in a totally different form. One that can also be used for the exalted skin. So yes, my theory right now is that all the forms of Mordekaiser that we can see here will be part of the skin. And because I like Mordekaiser's lore so much, I'm screwed. But anyway, here we can see San Uzal at the peak of him conquering the world when he was still living. And if you have a look around, you can see the first primal Noxians. Again, before it was still called Noxus. And you can see they are riding what seems to be the Draclops, which is the same immortal lizard that Kled is riding. It is a beast that should be native to the Dalamor plains around Noxus. It could also be just a basic basilisk, but basilisks are usually more green and dark. This is just yellow and light. It looks like lead. Sorry, the lizard's name is Scarl. After which, we can see Mordekaiser in his form, which I believe this is the same form we just saw, but hey, here he is just shown in a glorious way somewhere on the wall of the Immortal Bastion. And below that, I know it is hard to see, but we can see the Atakhan as we know him from Legends of Runeterra. After which, we get this scene, which is again another really cool moment. This shows us the moment San Uzal died the first time. So this is literally his corpse. This is his burial rite. And as it is mentioned, after he died, he lost his hold over the demon, and so Atakhan just went wild. In fact, you can see the helm of Katashli right here as the demon is leaving it. Because remember, it is technically bound to the item. After which the comic hints that as San Uzal died, his deeds kinda became a myth, until San Uzal would rise again. By this, the comic is referencing the one scene in the story where San Uzal whispered back into the realm of the living. So the hands of all of those people are the necromancers who brought San Uzal back into life. After which, they all died, because San Uzal killed them and forged their souls into a new mace. Anyway, again, if you look at the armor, that has to be one of the forms of the gacha skin. And actually, what I forgot to mention, the reason why you can only see a stand with the armor here was because the way San Uzal was resurrected is that he just whispered to the necromancers and told them to forge him a new armor to which he could be bound. So just like the new Atakhan was created with the binding to the helm, so was San Uzal technically resurrected by binding himself to his armor. So now you can see why this binding magic is such a cool theme for Mordekaiser. But that theme gets even cooler in a moment. Because next we can see the comic goes into centuries later, which on the timeline is known as the Reign of the Iron Revenant. This is when Mordekaiser was resurrected, and now he was just killing as many people as possible so that he can create as many dead souls in his own realm as possible. And here we can see that after he was resurrected, he was down to summon back his old buddies, which included Atakhan in his glorious state as he now looks in Legends of Runeterra. And you know how before Atakhan had more of the human arms because demons are preying on people and they like to sometimes mimic them to prey on them? Well, here he was just a pure shadow of destruction. And you can see how incredibly badass this demon became. However, it liked to stay free, and so Mordekaiser kinda had to show Atakhan where's his place. Again, this comic is just so badass. This is why I like to talk about Mordekaiser so much. But among all the people who were witnessing what's happening to Mordekaiser, of course, there is none other than LeBlanc. Because of course, if you've seen our video on Mordekaiser, you would know that eventually LeBlanc, who was hiding among Mordekaiser's advisors, was the one who banished Mordekaiser and essentially saved the entire continent from his conquest. The interesting thing here is that here, if this is LeBlanc, and I strongly believe this is LeBlanc, this is what was mentioned in the story, she not only looks concerned, but she looks surprised. So I wonder, was she actually loyal to San Uzal up until this point? Or was she just putting on a facade because she knew one day she would have to banish him and so she was just plotting in the shadows? This is a cool detail that I would like to explore somehow. But anyway, next we get to this part, which again is another really cool moment from the lore. In Mordekaiser's story it was mentioned that as his second reign began as the undead Iron Revenant, he used two beasts by his side to conquer the world. A beast of shadow, which we now know is Atakhan, as well as Tybolg, the great fire demon. So the reason why we can see Atakhan here, as well as all the fire around, could be because, yes, when you are conquering, things just inevitably burn down. But also, during this part of Mordekaiser's story, he was using Tybolg to burn his enemies. So again, an incredibly awesome nod to Mordekaiser's lore. And as the comic mentions, eventually, again, we all know this from the lore, all the surrounding tribes around the entire continent banded together and they fought Mordekaiser. And as they fought him, there was a destruction good enough for LeBlanc to banish Mordekaiser, which is exactly what we can see here. And so everything gets brought back together. So just like Mordekaiser was using the binding magic, which possibly originated from the Darkin to create the new Atakhan, so was the same magic used now to bind Mordekaiser to his armor and banish him back into the underworld. This is really cool because in the written lore, the specific way he was banished was never mentioned. We just know he was bound to his armor and just banished away. But here we can see that, yes, indeed, it was done by LeBlanc. And yes, you can see the sigil of the rose above her, which means the Black Rose was already established, which is why, if you have a look at the two people who banished Mordekaiser, you can see that LeBlanc is on one side, and on the other side, yes, that is young Vladimir. Or at least, young. He was still many centuries old now. He just looks young because he keeps sucking people. Literally. But of course, again, we all know this because we all watched the video on that, right? And that all brings us back to the present days, where we can see that LeBlanc is taking the one thing that is binding Atakhan. Because again, without Mordekaiser holding Atakhan's reins, knowing how to use binding magic, LeBlanc could do the same thing now. So again, in the present days, she took Atakhan, she took him somewhere into the world, we're not really sure where that is, and she planted him down. Now, even if you have a look at the background, I'm not really sure where this is, but this definitely seems like some kind of a lead into the story that is gonna happen next. This is definitely present days, she definitely is unleashing Atakhan right now, but we have no idea why And that is where the story is heading. Of course, here we can point out that yes, this is the new LeBlanc VGU, as was already revealed. And yes, you can see that the helmet is planted down just like it is on the Summoner's Rift. In game, when Atakhan spawns, he spawns from the helmet that was planted down. And after reading this comic, now we know that not only is Atakhan former Mordekaiser's buddy, but also the specific helmet that we can see on the Summoner's Rift dates back to ancient Noxus. Which brings us to the very end, and now you know the lore of Atakhan. Which means the next time you hop into a game, don't just be toxic, don't just call your opponents names. You can also teach them about the lore. Look, the honor system keeps getting cool rewards, so maybe you can get some points like this.